The day I became the most hated person in my neighborhood was the day I discovered I owned it. Or at least a very significant, sparkling, and frankly beautiful part of it. I promise you won't see this ending coming, because I certainly didn't. It started, as these things often do, with a ridiculous $50 fine. Just a pittance, really hardly enough to bother most people, but it was the principle of the thing. It was the condescension. It was the universal "I want to speak to the manager" haircut brought to life in the form of my homeowners association president, Deborah Albright. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have conceived of, was that I had inherited something far more valuable than the $50 she demanded, something that would turn her perfectly manicured world upside down. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my shoes, because for a long time, all I wanted was peace. I had moved to Whisperwood Lakes for that very reason. Peace. My career as a merger and acquisition attorney had been a relentless, grinding marathon of all-nighters, high-stakes negotiations, and an almost pathological need to be 5 steps ahead of everyone else. It was a world of sharp elbows and even sharper minds, where every deal was a zero-sum game, and the only metric of success was the body count of your opponents. After nearly 2 decades of that, culminating in a particularly brutal divorce that had stripped me of my energy, my optimism, and a significant portion of my worldly possessions, I was utterly, irrevocably burned out. I craved silence. I craved the soothing monotony of nature. I craved a place where the only battle I had to wage was against a stubborn fishing knot. The house itself was nothing spectacular, a modest 3-bedroom brick ranch, but it sat on a generous acre that sloped gently down to the shimmering expanse of Whispering Lake. My grandfather, a man whose wisdom had always been a quiet, grounding force in my life, had purchased the property decades ago. He wasn't a wealthy man in the conventional sense, but he was shrewd, tenacious, and possessed an almost instinctual understanding of value, whether it was in a piece of land or a man's character. He had taught me to fish on that very lake, patiently untangling my lines, baiting my hooks, and whispering stories of the ancient cypresses that ringed the far shore. This property wasn't just a house. It was a sanctuary, a tangible link to a past that felt increasingly distant and pure. It was where I came to heal, to simply be, to forget the relentless hum of my former life. I'd spent countless hours on the small dock he'd built, watching the sun set, casting my line into the placid water, feeling the taut pull as a bass took the bait. It was a meditative practice, a quiet communion with the natural world that slowly, painstakingly, began to knit my fractured soul back together. Then came Deborah Albright. She embodied everything I had sought to escape. She was the self-appointed queen of Whisperwood Lakes, an individual who believed that her perfectly sculpted hair and penchant for expensive athleisure gave her an inherent right to micromanage every blade of grass and every ripple on the water. Her husband, a perpetually golfing phantom, seemed to exist solely to fund her dictatorial whims. She drove an oversized white SUV, perpetually spotless, which she parked with almost military precision, a gleaming monument to her perceived superiority. She had an aura of manufactured importance, a forced smile that never quite reached her eyes, and a voice that, even when attempting pleasantries, managed to convey a profound sense of patronizing authority. She was, in short, a quintessential Karen, right down to the pinched expression that suggested perpetual dissatisfaction with anything that fell outside her meticulously ordered universe. The inciting incident was, as I said, laughably small. I was on my dock, enjoying a particularly still evening, the kind where the water perfectly mirrors the sky, and you feel like you could reach out and touch the inverted world beneath you. I had just landed a decent-sized, largemouth bass, carefully unhooked it, and was preparing to release it back into the cool depths when I heard the sharp, imperious tap-tap-tap of heels on my wooden dock. "Mr. Thorne," a voice cut through the twilight stillness, sharp as a freshly sharpened pencil. "A word, if you please." I turned, holding the fish gently in the water, watching it gasp. It was Deborah Albright, naturally. Her face was set in that familiar expression of mild offense, as if my very presence on my own dock was a personal affront. She stood ramrod straight, arms crossed, her eyes narrowed on my fishing rod. "President Albright," I replied, my voice calm, even. "Is there an issue?" She gestured vaguely at my fishing gear. "Indeed, there is. Several, in fact. We've received complaints regarding your activities on the lake." "Complaints?" I lifted an eyebrow. "From whom, exactly?" "That is neither here nor there," she dismissed, waving a hand airily. "What is here, Mr. Thorne, is your flagrant disregard for our community's ecological guidelines. Are you aware that the use of live bait, such as the minnows I observe in that bucket, can introduce invasive species into our delicate ecosystem?" I looked at my minnow bucket, then back at her. "Ma'am, these are native fathead minnows, purchased from a local bait shop. They're no more invasive than the crickets in your garden." She bristled, her perfectly sculpted hair seeming to stiffen. "Nonsense. And furthermore, your dock. It appears to be extending several feet beyond the established variance for waterfront properties. Such modifications require prior board approval, Mr. Thorne. We simply cannot have residents unilaterally altering the natural shoreline." My grandfather's dock, which had been there for 50 years, long before Deborah Albright's immaculate SUV ever graced these paved roads, longer than the HOA itself. I felt a slow burn begin in my chest. "That dock has been here since 1973, President Albright. It predates the HOA by a good decade. Be that as it may, current regulations supersede antiquated structures. Ignorance of the bylaws is no excuse, Mr. Thorne. And speaking of bylaws, we have photographic evidence of you casting your line into areas designated as sensitive fish spawning grounds. This is a direct violation of Section 7, Paragraph 4 of our covenant, which stipulates minimal disruption to aquatic flora and fauna. This behavior is entirely unacceptable." She pulled a small, laminated card from her blazer pocket. "Effective immediately, Mr. Thorne, you are hereby issued a formal warning. Any further infractions, particularly those regarding ecological negligence or unapproved structural modifications, will result in a $250 fine and potentially revocation of your lake access privileges." $250 for fishing in a lake that had been my sanctuary for decades. Revocation of lake access. The audacity was breathtaking. I felt the familiar legal gears begin to grind in my mind, a dormant part of me stirring. But I suppressed it. I had moved here for peace. "Understood, President Albright," I said, my voice carefully neutral. I gently released the base, watching its tail flick as it vanished into the murky depths. "I'll review the bylaws." She gave a curt nod, a triumph in her eyes, and then clicked her heels back across my dock and up the lawn, leaving behind a faint scent of expensive perfume and an undeniable pall of righteous indignation. The peace I had so desperately sought felt suddenly fragile, punctured. For a full week after that encounter, a strange internal debate raged within me. Part of me, the part that was utterly exhausted by conflict, simply wanted to comply, pay the hypothetical fine if it came, reel on my line if she frowned, anything to avoid engaging with this person, this embodiment of petty tyranny. I had escaped the corporate battles, the adversarial nature of my old life. I wasn't interested in fighting another one, especially not over something as trivial as fishing rights. My soul still felt raw, like an open wound, and the thought of stirring up any more emotional turmoil was abhorrent. I just wanted to fish. I just wanted to find my peace again. But another part of me, a deeper, more primal part, began to stir. It was the part that my grandfather had nurtured, the part that valued integrity and stood firm against injustice, however small. He had been a man of quiet strength, someone who never sought out a fight, but never backed down from one when it was right to stand his ground. He had taught me the value of diligence, of understanding the rules, and of respecting the land. Deborah Albright's condescension, her arbitrary pronouncements, her blatant disregard for historical fact and simple courtesy, gnawed at me. She hadn't just threatened my fishing. She had threatened my sanctuary, my connection to my past, the very peace I had moved here to find. She was trying to dictate how I lived on my property, on my lake. The word "my" resonated in my mind, a subtle echo that grew louder with each passing day. I thought of my grandfather. I remembered a particular conversation we'd had on that very dock many years ago. He was old then, his hands gnarled by a lifetime of work, his eyes still sparkling with wit. He'd told me, "Elias, always know what you own and always know what you don't. And never let anyone tell you what to do with what's rightfully yours." His words, simple as they were, had always carried the weight of profound truth. He had built this life for himself, for his family, brick by painstaking brick. He had fought his own battles against bureaucracy and petty officialdom, always with a quiet, steely resolve. He wouldn't have just rolled over. And neither, I realized with a sudden, cold clarity, would I. I refused to be bullied. The lawyer in me, the one I had thought was retired, was slowly, deliberately waking up. My first step was to pull out the HOA bylaws, the thick binder Deborah had referenced with such self-assured authority. I didn't just skim them. I devoured them. I read every clause, every subsection, every obscure amendment. My legal training had ingrained in me a meticulous approach to documentation, an almost obsessive need to understand the letter of the law. As I read, I began to notice inconsistencies, ambiguities, and curious omissions, especially concerning the lake itself. The bylaws stipulated regulations for the lake, but never explicitly stated ownership of the lakebed or the water rights. It was always referred to as common property, but the definition of common property was frustratingly vague. This vague language was a red flag the size of a billboard. In the world of M&A, vague language was often a smokescreen, a placeholder for something deliberately concealed or left unaddressed. It hinted at a potential weakness, a gap in the legal framework. My curiosity, once a professional necessity, now became a personal crusade. I began to dig deeper. I pulled out my property deed, the one my grandfather had passed down to me. It described the land parcel, its boundaries clearly delineated, but again, it was silent on the lake itself. This struck me as odd. Most waterfront properties explicitly define lake rights. I then went to the county records office, a place I hadn't set foot in for years. It was a dusty, labyrinthine repository of old maps, microfiche, and faded ledgers. I requested every document pertaining to the original subdivision of Whisperwood Lakes, going back to the earliest plat maps and land transfers. I spent days there, armed with a laptop, a scanner, and a thermos of strong coffee, meticulously cross-referencing parcel numbers, examining easement agreements, and tracing property lines. I found the original developer's filings, the formation documents for the HOA, every conceivable piece of paper related to the history of the land. I discovered that the subdivision had been developed in phases. The first phase, which included my grandfather's property, was older. Subsequent phases had annexed more land. The lake, it appeared, predated the subdivision entirely. It was a natural lake, not a man-made pond. This was a crucial distinction. The more I researched, the clearer the picture became. The original land grant for Whisperwood Lakes had included the surrounding land, but the lake itself had been treated as a separate entity, a natural resource. The developer, in his haste to create a marketable community, had somehow overlooked formally incorporating the lake into the HOA's common property deed. There were easements for community access, certainly, and provisions for maintenance of the shoreline and access points by the HOA, but nothing, absolutely nothing, explicitly transferred ownership of the lake bed or the water column above it to the homeowners association. It was an oversight, a massive, glaring omission that had simply been assumed away over the decades. The HOA had managed it, certainly had regulated it, but they had never actually owned it. Then, the eureka moment. It wasn't the county records. It was tucked away in a dusty old box of my grandfather's papers, documents I had inherited but never thoroughly sifted through until now. Among his meticulously organized tax returns and insurance policies, I found a faded, brittle document, a land trust agreement. It was dated a few years before the Whisperwood Lake subdivision was even conceived. In it, my grandfather, in his infinite foresight, had legally acquired a separate, distinct parcel of land that encompassed the entire lake bed, the water column, and a narrow perimeter around it. He had done this through a complex series of transactions, quietly purchasing small, overlooked parcels from a succession of farmers and landowners who didn't understand the full implications of what they were selling. He hadn't bought the lake to be an absentee landlord. He'd bought it to protect it, to ensure it remained a pristine, natural resource, free from the kind of development that had begun to creep across the landscape. The trust stipulated that the lake was to be preserved, its ecological integrity maintained, and access granted only under specific, carefully delineated conditions. And the beneficiary of that trust, upon his passing, was me. I sat there, the old paper shaking slightly in my hands, a profound sense of awe washing over me. My grandfather, the quiet, unassuming man who had taught me to fish, had owned the very lake Deborah Albright was claiming I was damaging. He hadn't just passed down a house. He had passed down an entire body of water, a natural treasure, and the legal means to protect it. The thought was staggering. The fine print of the trust agreement confirmed it. I, Elias Thorne, was the sole trustee, with absolute legal ownership and control over Whispering Lake. The HOA had been regulating my lake, finding people for my lake, laying claim to my lake, all under a decades-long delusion of ownership. The anger that had simmered within me now solidified into a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't just about a $50 fine anymore. This was about principle, about legacy, and about setting things right. The sleeping giant had well and truly woken up. The first person I consulted was Miles Corbin, an old family friend and a retired corporate attorney who had occasionally advised my grandfather on various business dealings. Miles was a walking encyclopedia of legal precedent and a master strategist, renowned for his ability to dissect complex legal problems with surgical precision. He had a dry wit, a perpetually rumpled suit, and eyes that missed nothing. I drove to his quiet, book-filled study, laid out all my findings, the original plat maps, the HOA bylaws, my deed, and most importantly, the trust agreement. Miles listened patiently, occasionally stroking his chin, his gaze moving from document to document. When I finished, the room was silent save for the ticking of an antique grandfather clock. He leaned back in his leather chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Elias," he said, his voice a low rumble, "your grandfather was a brilliant man. Ahead of his time, truly. He didn't just buy a lake. He built a fortress around it, legally speaking. This trust is ironclad. It predates the HOA. It clearly defines the boundaries, and it vests complete ownership and control in you as trustee and beneficiary." He tapped the trust document. "The HOA has been operating under an assumption, a collective delusion of ownership that has gone unchallenged for decades. Their bylaws govern the use of common areas, yes, but they cannot govern something they do not own. Any attempts to fine you, or anyone else, for activities on this lake are entirely without legal basis. They are, in fact, an overreach of authority, bordering on trespass if they attempt to enforce anything on your property." A sense of vindication, icy and satisfying, spread through me. So, they have no legal leg to stand on. "None whatsoever regarding the lake itself," Miles confirmed, his smile widening. "They can regulate the docks on their own land, perhaps, or enforce rules on their designated common access points. But they cannot tell you how to fish in your lake, nor can they claim ownership of your dock if it's on your parcel of land, which it is. This is a beautiful piece of legal chess, Elias, and your grandfather played it perfectly." We spent the next few days meticulously formulating a strategy. This wasn't going to be a quick, blunt force attack. My years in corporate law had taught me the value of strategic patience, of letting your opponent overplay their hand, of building an unassailable case before you spring the trap. We agreed on a multi-phase approach. Phase 1, subtle probing. Phase 2, controlled escalation. Phase 3, the final, undeniable reveal. The objective wasn't just to win. It was to dismantle Deborah Albright's reign of terror entirely. "You have the ultimate weapon, Elias," Miles said, gesturing to the trust document. "But don't reveal it until they've made enough mistakes to bury themselves. Let them dig their own grave." My first move was seemingly innocuous. I wrote a polite, carefully worded email to the HOA board, carbon copying Deborah Albright, requesting clarification on the precise legal description of the lake's ownership, as referred to in the bylaws. I cited specific sections that seemed ambiguous and asked for the full chain of title documents for the lakebed itself. I framed it as a genuine inquiry from a new resident seeking to understand the community's governance. I received a dismissive reply from Deborah within hours. It was a canned response, reiterating that the lake was a common community asset and that all questions regarding its governance were addressed in the bylaws, which I was encouraged to reread more carefully. There was an unmistakable undertone of condescension, a clear signal that she perceived my inquiry as either ignorant or an attempt to skirt the rules. She even added, almost as an afterthought, a veiled warning about frivolous inquiries that consume valuable board resources. Perfect. She had fallen for the bait. She dismissed my legitimate legal inquiry, confident in her perceived authority. This provided a crucial piece of evidence: her willful ignorance, her refusal to engage with a legal question that directly challenged her assumed power. Next, I began meticulously gathering evidence of Albright's transgressions. My background had also trained me to be a master of documentation. I installed discrete security cameras on my property, pointing toward the lake and my dock, ensuring I had video evidence of any future encounters. My smartphone became my constant companion, ready to record any interaction. I also started quietly reaching out to other residents, people who had also been victimized by Albright's arbitrary fines, her public shaming, or her general dictatorial style. Many were initially hesitant, fearful of retaliation, but as I subtly hinted at a potential solution, a glimmer of hope sparked in their eyes. There was Mary Henderson, an elderly widow who had been fined for leaving a small bird feeder too close to the common area path. There was the young couple, the Millers, who had been threatened with legal action for having a non-standard mailbox. And there was Robert Chun, a quiet man who had lived in Whisperwood Lakes even longer than my grandfather, who had stories of Albright diverting HOA funds for her own personal landscaping projects and turning a blind eye to violations by her favorite cronies. I listened, I documented, and I offered quiet validation. "This isn't right," I'd say, and their relief would be palpable. I collected their stories, their copies of official warnings, their canceled checks for unwarranted fines. I built a dossier not just against Albright, but against the entire corrupt structure she had so carefully cultivated. The next escalation came not from me, but from Albright. After my email, she seemed to take my mere existence as a personal challenge. She began to conduct what she called lake patrols, driving her pristine SUV slowly along the shoreline roads, peering onto private properties. One afternoon, as I was again quietly fishing from my dock, she pulled up, not on my property, but on the common access point nearby. She had another board member with her, a nervous, perpetually apologetic man named Arthur. "Mr. Thorne," she called out, her voice amplified by the open window of her SUV. "I hope you've reconsidered your fishing practices. I've received further reports of suspicious activity near your property, possibly involving unauthorized netting." I slowly reeled in my line, my face expressionless. "President Albright, I assure you, I am simply fishing, using legal methods on my own dock. That dock, Mr. Thorne, remains in violation, and your private fishing is impacting the delicate balance of our community's prized aquatic life. We are a family community, Mr. Thorne. We have children who swim in these waters. Your reckless disregard for our bylaws puts them at risk." She was escalating the accusations, moving from minor infractions to vague, defamatory claims about safety and ecological damage. This was precisely what Miles and I had anticipated. She was building a public narrative, attempting to paint me as a reckless, dangerous rogue. With all due respect, President Albright, I replied, keeping my voice even, my activities are fully compliant with state and local fishing regulations. Perhaps you should clarify which specific bylaw I am violating beyond the ambiguous claims you've previously made. Her face flushed. Do not be impertinent, Mr. Thorne. I am the elected president of this association, and I am responsible for the welfare of this community. Your continued recalcitrance is noted. Then came the line that, for me, erased any lingering desire for a peaceful resolution. She paused, then added, her voice dripping with false concern, I sincerely hope this won't require us to involve the local wildlife authorities, Mr. Thorne. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings about illegal fishing or perhaps even improper waste disposal. That was a direct threat, a veiled accusation of criminal activity. Not just a fine, but a potential legal entanglement with state agencies, a stain on my reputation. She had crossed the line. She was weaponizing her position, escalating a petty grievance into something genuinely malicious. The strategic plan solidified in my mind. It was time to accelerate. Later that week, true to her word, Deborah Albright made her move. I was on my dock again, ostensibly fishing, but in reality, baiting the trap. Sure enough, a county vehicle, not the sheriff, but a Department of Natural Resources vehicle, pulled up to the common access point. A man in a uniform, a state wildlife officer, stepped out. He looked professional, serious, and utterly out of place in this manicured suburban landscape. Deborah Albright, of course, was right behind him in her white SUV, a smug, triumphant expression plastered on her face. Officer, she began, gesturing dramatically towards me on my dock. That's him, Mr. Thorne. He's been engaging in highly suspicious and potentially illegal fishing activities. We've had reports of him using prohibited methods, possibly even harming protected species. He's a menace to our lake ecosystem. The officer, a tall, burly man with a neatly trimmed beard, approached my dock. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who deals with genuine infractions, not HOA drama. Morning, sir, he said, his voice calm, assessing. Officer Miller, Department of Natural Resources. Ma'am here called in a complaint about illegal fishing. Good morning, officer, I replied, standing up straight. My heart rate was steady. This was exactly what I wanted. I'm a yes Thorne. I assure you, I'm only fishing with a rod and reel, using legal bait. My catch and release policy is strictly adhered to, and I identify all fish before release. Officer Miller walked onto my dock, his eyes scanning my bait bucket, my tackle box, my fishing rod. He seemed to take in the serene surroundings, the clear water, the healthy fish I had just released. He looked at the minnows in my bucket. These look like fathead minnows, he observed. They are, officer, I confirmed. Purchased from Bob's Bait and Tackle, licensed vendor, state certified as non-invasive. Albright interjected. He claims he's using legal bait. Officer, but we have reason to believe he's introduced foreign species into our waters. And his dock. It's an unregistered, illegal structure. Officer Miller turned to Albright, a subtle shift in his demeanor. Ma'am, my jurisdiction covers wildlife and environmental regulations. Dock permits are typically a county or local issue, unless there's a direct environmental impact. He looked back at me. Do you have a state fishing license, Mr. Thorne? Right here, officer. I pulled out my wallet, showing him my digital license on my phone. He examined it. Valid. Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Thorne. I see no evidence of illegal activity here. Your minnows are legal bait for this area. Your equipment is standard, and the fish I see in the water appear healthy. Ma'am, he turned back to Albright, his voice firmer. Unless you have specific, tangible evidence of a violation of state wildlife laws, I'm afraid there's nothing for me to investigate here. My time is best spent on legitimate environmental concerns. Albright's face was a mask of furious indignation. But he's clearly damaging the lake. He's polluting it. His activities are disruptive. Officer Miller sighed, clearly annoyed. Ma'am, fishing responsibly does not damage a lake. If anything, It indicates a healthy ecosystem. I've seen no evidence of pollution and certainly no harm to wildlife here. I'm satisfied that Mr. Thorne is in full compliance with state regulations. He turned to me. You have a good day, Mr. Thorne. Keep up the responsible fishing. Thank you, officer, I said, a small, knowing smile playing on my lips. As Officer Miller walked back to his vehicle, Albright launched into a furious tirade, her voice barely contained. This is outrageous. This is utterly unacceptable. I will be contacting your superiors. Officer, this man is clearly a menace. Officer Miller simply got into his truck and drove away, leaving Albright fuming in the dust. Her eyes, when they met mine, were filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. This was the moment I knew she had gone too far. She had not only slandered me to a state official, but she had failed spectacularly, publicly. She had given me precisely the public humiliation I needed. The time had come for the coup de grace. I had scheduled an emergency HOA meeting for that very evening. Citing a critical matter of community governance and property rights, Albright, undoubtedly seething from her public embarrassment, had approved it, likely assuming it was my desperate attempt to clear my name, to beg for leniency. She was wrong. The community clubhouse was packed. Word had spread like wildfire about the wildlife officer incident, and the air was thick with anticipation. Residents sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs, whispering, their eyes flicking between me and Deborah Albright, who sat at the head of the long table, flanked by her nervous board members. She wore a severe black suit, her hair pulled back even more tightly than usual, her face a thundercloud. All right, quiet down, she snapped, banging a gavel that looked far too large for her dainty hand. We are here tonight at the request of Mr. Elias Thorne, who apparently believes his personal grievances warrant an emergency meeting. Let's get this over with, shall we? She glowered at me. Mr. Thorne, you have the floor. Try to keep it brief. I stood up, adjusting the lapels of my blazer. I had dressed simply, but with authority. I carried a single, slim briefcase. Thank you, President Albright, I said, my voice calm, projecting clearly to the back of the room. I appreciate the opportunity to address the community regarding a matter of, as you rightly put it, critical importance to property rights and governance here in Whisperwood Lakes. I walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room, taking a marker. Albright watched me, her eyes narrowed, undoubtedly expecting some form of complaint or apology. Over the past few months, I've had the distinct displeasure of being repeatedly harassed and unfairly targeted by our esteemed HOA president, Deborah Albright, concerning my activities on Whispering Lake. I've been issued unwarranted fines, baseless warnings, and even had my character publicly impugned, culminating in a frivolous complaint to the Department of Natural Resources, which, as many of you know, resulted in an officer finding no wrongdoing on my part. A murmur went through the room. Albright slammed her gavel again. Order. Mr. Thorne, this is not a platform for personal attacks. Stick to the bylaws. Oh, I assure you, President Albright, I said, my voice taking on a subtle, sharper edge, I intend to stick very closely to the bylaws, and to county records, and to state law, because what I'm about to reveal fundamentally changes everything you believe you know about this community. I turned to the whiteboard. For decades, this community, under the leadership of this HOA, has operated under the assumption that Whispering Lake is a common community asset, owned and controlled by the Homeowners Association. This assumption, I regret to inform you, is entirely, legally, unequivocally false. A collective gasp swept through the room. Albright's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine shock replacing her usual arrogance. Nonsense, she spluttered, half rising from her chair. That is an outrageous lie. The lake is common property. It's in our bylaws. Indeed, it's referred to as common property, I corrected, but the bylaws conveniently omit the actual chain of title. Because President Albright, the HOA, does not and has never owned Whispering Lake. I paused, letting that sink in. Instead, legal ownership of the entire lake bed, the water column, and the surrounding 10 feet of shoreline was acquired through a series of private transactions in the 1960s by a man named Arthur Thorne. My grandfather. I saw the color drain from Albright's face. She looked like she'd been punched. The board members exchanged bewildered glances. My grandfather, a man of remarkable foresight and a deep love for this natural resource, established a private, irrevocable land trust long before this subdivision was even a glimmer in a developer's eye. This trust, legally registered and binding, ensured the preservation of the lake's ecological integrity. Upon his passing, the trusteeship, and indeed the full legal control, passed to me, Elias Thorne. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a stack of neatly organized documents, certified copies of the original land grants, the county plat maps, the original trust agreement, and the updated trustee documents. I laid them out on the table. Here, I said, sweeping my hand across the papers, are the certified deeds, the trust agreement, and all supporting documentation. This legal documentation unequivocally proves that Whispering Lake is, and has always been, private property. My private property. Chaos erupted. Whispers turned into excited murmurs, then outright exclamations. People were leaning forward, craning their necks, trying to make sense of this revelation. Albright, however, recovered quickly, her face contorting into a mask of rage. This is a fabrication, a complete and utter lie. You forged these documents. You're trying to usurp community property. Madam President, I said, my voice cutting through the noise, these are certified county records. They are verifiable by any attorney, any land surveyor, or frankly, any resident with access to public records. Your repeated attempts to regulate, fine, and control activities on property you do not own constitute a flagrant abuse of power and, indeed, a pattern of continuous trespass. I turned to the community, my voice softening slightly, but maintaining its authoritative tone. For years, many of you have suffered under arbitrary rules, unjust fines, and the constant threat of retaliation from this HOA board, specifically from President Albright. I have gathered evidence, not just from my own experience, but from many of you. I gestured to the people in the front rows. Mary Henderson, the Millers, Robert Shunn, and many others, all of whom have stories of being unfairly targeted and financially exploited. As the legal owner of Whispering Lake, I continued, I am hereby formally notifying the Homeowners Association that all previous rules, regulations, and fines pertaining to the lake are null and void. Any attempt by this HOA or any individual associated with it to regulate, restrict access to, or impose fines regarding Whispering Lake will be met with immediate legal action, including but not limited to lawsuits for trespass, harassment, and recovery of damages. I looked directly at Albright. Furthermore, President Albright, your pattern of abuse, your misrepresentation of facts, your harassment of residents, and your reckless disregard for property rights has eroded the trust of this community. As the primary property owner impacted by your gross negligence and deliberate misdirection, I intend to pursue all available legal avenues to hold you personally and professionally accountable for your actions, including seeking a formal audit of HOA finances given allegations of misappropriation and a review of all previous fines issued without legal authority. Albright was sputtering, her face a fiery red. You can't do this. I am the president. I have authority. She looked desperately at her fellow board members, but their faces were a mixture of shock and dawning horror. They knew, as I did, that this was the end of her reign. Your authority, Madam President, I concluded, my voice cold and precise, ceased the moment you attempted to exert it over property you did not own. This meeting, intended by you to be my public shaming, is now a public unmasking. The lake is not yours. The rules you imposed are not valid. And your time as president, I believe, is now, unequivocally, over. The murmurs exploded into a roar. People began to stand up, some cheering, some shouting, all directed at Albright. Her board members began to distance themselves, literally inching their chairs away from her. Arthur, the nervous man, stood up and stammered. I had no idea, Deborah. You never showed us these documents. Albright tried to regain control, banging her gavel frantically, but the sound was swallowed by the clamor. She was isolated, exposed, and utterly powerless. Her attempts to intimidate, to dismiss, to cling to her false authority were futile and pathetic. The power had shifted irrevocably. The aftermath was swift and devastating for Deborah Albright. The following days were a whirlwind of legal filings, community meetings, and media attention. My carefully assembled dossier, detailing her reign of terror and the newly exposed fraud regarding the lake's ownership, was released to the community and, discreetly, to a few local news outlets. The stories from Mary Henderson, the Millers, Robert Shunn, and dozens of other residents poured out, painting a clear picture of a president who had abused her power for personal gain and a pathological need for control. Within 72 hours of that tumultuous HOA meeting, Deborah Albright had resigned in disgrace. The resignation, a terse, bitter email, claimed she was stepping down due to unforeseen personal matters, but everyone knew the truth. The county prosecutor's office, alerted by a few of the more vocal residents and my own discreet inquiries, launched an investigation into the HOA's financial records. The audit quickly revealed that Albright had indeed been siphoning off funds for her personal landscaping projects and awarding lucrative, no-bid contracts to businesses owned by her husband's cronies. The fines she had levied, particularly the more egregious ones, were flagged as legally dubious at best, outright extortion at worst. Faced with potential criminal charges and a barrage of civil lawsuits from the residents she had wronged, Albright and her perpetually absent husband quietly put their sprawling, ostentatious house on the market. They sold it at a significant loss, forced to liquidate their assets to cover legal fees and restitution. Within weeks, they were gone, vanished from Whisperwood Lakes as if they had never existed, leaving behind only the lingering scent of stale ambition and the memory of their petty tyranny. It was a complete, total downfall, and a victory that tasted sweeter than any corporate acquisition. Now, in a position of total power regarding Whispering Lake, I chose to exercise it not with vengeance, but with a firm, just hand. My priority was to honor my grandfather's legacy and restore the true spirit of the community. I did not revoke lake access for the residents. Instead, I established new, fair terms. I drafted a comprehensive lake access agreement, outlining clear, reasonable rules for fishing, boating, and general enjoyment of the water. These rules focused on conservation, safety, and respect for the natural environment. I specifically included provisions for responsible catch and release, limits on boat motor sizes to prevent erosion and noise pollution, and designated swimming areas. These were not arbitrary dictates. They were carefully considered regulations designed to protect the lake for future generations. I presented this agreement to the newly formed interim HOA board, comprised of sensible, community-minded residents like Mary Henderson and Robert Shunn. I offered to allow the HOA to manage access to the lake on my behalf, under these new terms, with a clear understanding that true ownership remained with the Thorn Lake Trust. I stipulated that any fines levied for violations of the new rules would be nominal and directly reinvested into lake maintenance and conservation efforts, not siphoned off for personal gain. The community overwhelmingly embraced these new terms. It was a tangible shift from arbitrary control to collaborative stewardship. The first new, ethical HOA board was elected with Robert Shunn as its president. They were dedicated to transparency, community input, and genuinely serving the residents. The community was demonstrably better off, freed from the oppressive shadow of Albright's rule. The air in Whisperwood Lakes felt lighter, the smiles on people's faces more genuine. The final scenes of my story are often the quietest, the most fulfilling. I still live in my modest brick ranch, still walk down to the dock my grandfather built, still cast my line into the now truly tranquil waters of Whispering Lake. The peace I had sought after my divorce, after the burnout of my career, had finally, profoundly settled upon me. It was a deeper, more robust peace, one earned through standing up for what was right, through protecting a legacy. The lake now feels truly mine, not in a possessive way, but in a custodial sense. I am its guardian, its protector. I often sit on the dock at sunset, the same way my grandfather used to, and I feel his presence there, strong and silent. To honor him, I commissioned a small, discreet bronze plaque affixed to one of the ancient cypress trees near the shoreline. It simply reads, "Whispering Lake, a gift of preservation, dedicated to Arthur Thorne, 1918 to 2005. The moral of the story, as I've come to understand it, is multifaceted. Bullies, especially those intoxicated by petty power, often defeat themselves through their own arrogance and lack of diligence. True power, the kind that truly makes a difference, comes not from bluster or manufactured authority, but from knowledge, from understanding the rules, and from having the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it feels easier to simply comply. And sometimes, the quietest individuals, those seeking only peace, possess the deepest wells of strength and the most formidable weapons. They are the sleeping giants, and when provoked, they can move mountains, or in my case, reclaim an entire lake. So, next time you think about letting someone push you around, remember, you might just own the ground they're standing on.